Hello and welcome to the Dumbfounded podcast, where I dig up the weirdest, wildest, and straight up dumbest moments in history. Because apparently, stupidity isn't just a modern thing. I'm Thomas Collins, and every month I try to prove that the past was just as ridiculous as the present. So, with that, let's get dumbfounded. All right, let's wind back the clock to 1918 in Romania. World War I had just wrapped up, and the Habsburgs were unemployed, and everyone was trying to figure out how to exist without being shelled every other weekend. Enter Nicolae Ceaușescu. Born in a dirt-poor village called Scornachest, Ceaușescu was one of 10 kids, which in post-war Eastern Europe basically meant that your family was one bad harvest away from selling furniture for potatoes. At age 11, our boy drops out of school and moves to Bucharest. Why? To become a shoemaker's apprentice. That's right. The man who would one day call himself the genius of the Carpathians started by fixing other people's boots. It's a Cinderella arc, but communist. Now, during this time, Romania is kind of a hot mess. You've got fascists, monarchists, communists, basically a political clown car on fire. And little Nicolae, for reasons we may never fully understand outside of severe head trauma, picks communism at age 14. So imagine this. It's the 1930s, and you're a teenager in Bucharest. And instead of chasing girls or playing soccer, you're like, yeah, let's overthrow the government. This is absolute menace behavior. Anyway, he joins the Romanian Communist Party, which at this point is illegal, and immediately becomes known to the cops. Over the next decade, he's arrested like 8 times, and not for cool stuff either. We're not talking like spy rings or revolutionary sabotage. Mostly, he's just handing out pamphlets and refusing to shut up about Lenin. By the time World War II kicks off, Ceaușescu's already done more jail time than actual work, but that jail time, it pays off for him. Because in prison, he meets George Dej, guy who is 90% fouls and 100% communist. Dej takes young Nicolae under his wing like some kind of communist Obi-Wan and teaches him how to play the long game. And by long game, I mean wait for the Soviets to win the war and ride their tanks into power. And guess what? It works. Post-World War II, Romania becomes a Soviet satellite state. Dej rises to power, and little Nicolae gets yeeted into party leadership. So, by the 1950s, he's the Minister of Agriculture. Then, he gets promoted to Head of Internal Affairs, which translates to he's now in charge of snitching and spying. Eventually, he becomes the second in command under Dej. And when Dej dies in 1965, Ceaușescu gets the nod as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And here's the twist. At first, everyone thinks he's the cool communist, and no joke, they actually liked him. He tells the Soviets to shove it on a few things, he doesn't invade Czechoslovakia in '68, and even goes on a world tour. He meets Nixon, Queen Elizabeth, Charles de Gaulle. I probably pronounced his name wrong, I'm sorry for all of you. But bro's out here cosplaying as a moderate reformer while secretly planning to LARP as Stalin 2.0. It's like watching a Bond villain get invited to the UN and everyone immediately claps because he's not immediately kicking puppies on stage. Now, even during this golden boy phase, there are signs. He starts giving weirdly long speeches, referring to himself in the third person, and promoting his wife, Elena, like she's Marie Curie and not a glorified lunch lady with a diploma that's written in crayon. But we'll get to her later. That's his own crime scene. Alright, so quick recap. Poor kid with a boot fetish joins the Communist Party at puberty and gets mentored by Romania's original Stalin, rides the Soviet power vacuum to the top, and then tricks the West into thinking he's Diet Tito. And that's just the origin story. Soon, he goes full narcissist, creates a cult of personality so intense it makes North Korea look like a chill book club, and starts putting his face on literal fields of wheat. Because when you think of healthy leadership, you obviously think of agricultural portrait. Now let's talk about this cult of personality. So we're mid-late 1960s, and Ceaușescu's in charge. People still think he's Romania's nice communist, and things seem fine-ish, but underneath that beige political exterior is a guy who's about to go full personality cult, like Kim Jong-un levels, but with less hair and more concrete. Alright, let's get this out of the way now. Ceaușescu was obsessed with himself. Not in a, man, I look good today kind of way. In a, let's build a literal religion around me kind of way. And he found the ultimate inspiration for his narcissistic fever dream in the most cursed travel destination imaginable, North Korea. So he takes a diplomatic tour of Asia. We're talking China, North Korea, Vietnam. And when he hits North Korea, he has a revelation, like Paul on the road to Damascus, except for instead of finding Jesus, he finds North Korea and his ideology of self-reliance and infinite ego stroking. So, he comes home, and suddenly, Romania's political playbook gets written by a guy who took notes during a dictatorship safari. Mass parades? Check. Mandatory public worship? Check. Children waving flags like they're in a hostage musical? Double check. He launches what he calls the July Thesis, which is just a fancy way of saying no more fun, no more art, and every third building has to include a portrait of my face. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about Romanian television under Ceaușescu. There were 2 channels, and that's it. One of them got shut down. The remaining one aired about 2 hours a day, and 90% of its airtime was just Ceaușescu giving speeches. And not good speeches. Not "we shall fight on the beaches" speeches. We're talking full-on word salad, like if Google Translate got drunk and tried to explain Marxism to a potted plant. And the people had to watch. Because the secret police, and we'll get to those psychos later, were everywhere. If you changed the channel or made a face during a speech, congrats. You're now doing hard labor in a mine with your extended family. So, I want to take a second to talk about his wife, Elena. Because this is where the story goes from ridiculous to what in the hell is this, a sitcom? Elena was barely literate. She failed chemistry school, and she had all the charisma of a damp napkin. But thanks to her husband's massive ego and the army of terrified sycophants, she was declared a world-renowned scientist. They gave her dozens of honorary degrees from universities that were like, sure, just don't invade us. She was listed as co-author on scientific papers she couldn't even read. And to top it off, at one point, she was named president of the National Council for Science and Technology. It's like giving a toddler a research funding because she said proton once in a Peppa Pig episode. Meanwhile, Ceaușescu kicks off a little thing called systemization, which is a fancy word for we're going to bulldoze entire towns and rebuild them to match my personal Minecraft server. Historic buildings? Gone. Villages with 100 years of culture? Flattened. Family homes? Replaced with gray concrete blocks and model worker housing. All of this just to make the capital look symmetrical when Ceaușescu viewed it from his future megapalace. Because God forbid Bucharest doesn't line up with Ceaușescu's bathroom window. This dude treated real-life urban development like your 6-year-old redesigning a Lego city after stepping on one bare foot. Now, let me just read you a few of Ceaușescu's official titles that he gave himself. Genius of the Carpathians, the Danube of Thought, no idea what that means, Hero among Heroes, the Architect of Romania's Future, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Knight of the Golden Spur, also no idea what that one even means, and my personal favorite, the Treasure of the Nation. Dude wasn't just ruining the country, he was LARPing as an anime protagonist with a fan club made entirely of unpaid interns. So by the late 70s, Romania isn't being run by a government. It's being run by a married couple who are cosplaying as gods. Everyone's either terrified, starving, or faking happiness harder than the cast of a Chuck E. Cheese birthday shift. And Ceaușescu's about to take his next genius idea out for a spin. Let's micromanage childbirth and literally control the nation's reproductive system like it's part of the GDP. And yeah, that's real, and it goes horribly wrong. Okay, so the 1970s are over, and Ceaușescu's firmly in his dictator with a god complex mode. He's got the portraits, the palaces, the fake science degrees for his wife. He's collected the whole set. Now, he turns his attention to something truly bonkers, the wombs of the Romanian people. Because, in Ceaușescu's mind, Romania doesn't have enough Romanians. So instead of fixing poverty or making life suck less, he does what every deranged dictator does when he runs out of ideas. He blames the women. So, enter his Decree 770, the Make More Babies Law. A law that banned abortion and contraception overnight. No warning, no discussion, just BAM! If you're a woman under 45, your uterus now belongs to the state. This wasn't just a policy. It was forced breeding with a propaganda budget. Posters went up saying, "The fetus is the property of the entire society," which is a weird thing to say unless you're a Bond villain trying to grow an army of clones. So here's the logistics of this insanity. Gynecologists were turned into government snitches. Women had mandatory monthly pregnancy checks at work. If you weren't pregnant and had no good excuse, the state assumed you were sabotaging the revolution. Miscarriages were investigated like murder scenes. And if you did have an illegal abortion, congratulations, now you're a criminal. It was the Handmaid's Tale, but with worse plumbing and more mold. So did this plan work? Kinda. Birth rates doubled. But here's the thing Ceaușescu didn't consider, because he was too busy measuring his next marble staircase. No one could afford these kids. Food was scarce, housing sucked, healthcare was collapsing, and people were freezing in their homes in the winter. And now they're supposed to raise more kids on 0 calories and 2 light bulbs a week? It gets worse. Thousands of parents abandoned their kids, leading to the rise of Romania's state orphanage system, which was just horrifying. Even the Soviets were like, dude, tone it down. Orphanages overflowed. Malnutrition, disease, abuse, you name it. A whole generation of unwanted kids raised in what can only be described as a government-sponsored horror movie. Now, while Ceaușescu's busy micromanaging uteruses, he also starts tanking the economy like it's a side quest. He decides that Romania will pay off all its foreign debt, which sounds reasonable, right? But how does he do it? By exporting everything. Food, fuel, medicine, everything to pay his creditors. And the Romanian people? They were left with shortages so bad it made Soviet Russia look like a Whole Foods. People stood in line for hours for bread, milk, and meat. Electricity was rationed to a few hours a day, and hot water, maybe once a week. And gasoline? You could only get that if you were Ceaușescu. There's a story of an entire apartment block being wired to a single street lamp because the power cuts were that bad. But hey, the country was debt-free. It was just completely unlivable. And speaking of that, let's talk food. In 1982, the government introduced a program called the Rational Eating Program, which is the most dystopian name for "you're not getting dinner" in history. The state literally published calorie maximums for citizens based on how much physical labor they did, which is wild because the only workout most people were getting was waiting in food lines. You ever stand in a line for 5 hours for a chicken leg only to get to front and hear, "Sorry, we're out, but here's some state-approved pickled cabbage"? That was Romania for a decade. Now, while all this is happening, Ceaușescu and Elena are living in basically a palace with gold doorknobs, fur-lined bathrooms, and imported Swiss chocolate. They had their own private baker who made them warm bread while the rest of the country ate boiled cornmeal and lies. He built himself a personal train car with silk curtains and a minibar and used it to tour cities he bulldozed. You ever see someone light money on fire while screaming about fiscal responsibility? That, but with statues. So, let's summarize what Ceaușescu achieved in this phase of his genius leadership. He criminalized contraception. He flooded the country with unwanted, starving children. He gutted the economy to pay debt that nobody cared about. And he did all of this while hoarding luxury goods like a Bond villain hoards monologues. And we're still not at the palace. Because when your people are starving in the streets, the obvious solution is to build the second largest administrative building in the world right after the Pentagon. So, it's the mid-1980s, and the rest of the Eastern Bloc is starting to wobble. The Berlin Wall's got cracks in it, and Soviet communism is on life support. But over in Romania, Ceaușescu looks around at all this collapse and thinks, you know what, I think I need a bigger house, guys. Let's do that. So let me introduce you to the People's Palace, which is hilarious because it's A, not for the people, B, not remotely modest, and C, technically still unfinished. This thing is a 4 billion pound concrete juggernaut. It's the second largest administrative building in the world after the Pentagon, except, unlike the Pentagon, this thing has chandeliers the size of school buses and marble staircases that were redesigned multiple times because he didn't like the way his footsteps sounded. You know, you've really lost touch with the reality when you fire your architects because the stairs aren't dramatic enough. So, here's the numbers that might hurt your soul. Over 700 architects were involved. 20,000 workers built it. It has 1,100 rooms. It consumes more electricity than most small towns. And get this, 70% of Bucharest's historic center was destroyed to make space for it. Churches, synagogues, parks, and homes, all bulldozed. Not relocated, not preserved, just vaporized, so Nicolae could have a symmetrical view. It's like if you demolished half of Paris so you could get better lighting for your TikTok dance videos. While this monstrosity was being built, Romania was struggling. Bread lines were miles long, babies were dying in hospitals with no heat, and people cooked by candlelight and bathed in buckets. Meanwhile, the palace had imported Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, velvet-covered meeting halls, and entire ballrooms used once, maybe, just to prove that they existed. It wasn't just a palace. It was a temple to his own ego built out of money stolen from the people who literally couldn't afford soap. When the building was quote-unquote done, spoiler, it never really was, Ceaușescu didn't even throw a party because he was too paranoid to actually live there. He thought it might be bugged or bombed or, even worse, used against him. So, the one guy it was built for never spent a single night inside. It's the equivalent of buying a Ferrari and then riding the bus because you don't trust the engine. By this point, the rest of the world is like, hey, Romania, you guys okay? Because the reports are leaking out. Orphanages, famine, repression, economic collapse. It's looking real bad. So Ceaușescu doubles down. He tightens censorship, ramps up surveillance, and declares his palace a symbol of Romania's eternal future. Which is ironic considering he'd be dead within 4 years, and the same building would be used as proof of how disconnected he was from reality. Now, I want to talk about his secret police. The Securitate police force was so massive and paranoid they made the KGB look like mall cops. And by the late 1980s, Romania had one Securitate agent for every 50 citizens, plus millions of informants, neighbors, co-workers, family members, all potential snitches. You couldn't joke, sigh, roll your eyes, or even look tired during a speech without risking a visit to one of their friendly interrogation centers. At one point, someone got arrested for ironing over Ceaușescu's face on a newspaper by accident. Fast forward to December 1989. Eastern Europe is an open rebellion. Berlin's wall is down. Communism is crumbling. But in Romania, Ceaușescu still thinks he's invincible. He gives a televised speech to a huge crowd in Bucharest, and here's the moment the whole regime cracks. He says something along the lines of, "Long live the socialist revolution," and for the first time ever, the crowd boos. And you can see it on his face. Confusion, panic, shock, because nobody's booed him since the 1960s. He raises his hand to calm them, and the noise grows louder. The man who built palaces, rewrote laws, and made the nation starve just to worship him was finally hearing the sound of reality. Now these boos aren't just a, hey, we're a little upset. They are, hey, we might start tearing this place apart. And you can see him freeze. He looks to Elena, and she's confused. The camera cuts out, and the revolution begins. Within hours, protests are turning into riots. Police are overwhelmed. The army, who'd been propping up Ceaușescu for years, starts to waver. And here's where it gets spicy. He orders the military to fire on civilians. Some commanders obey, and some refuse. Some literally switch sides on the spot. But by the next day, tanks are rolling through Bucharest. But nobody's really sure whose side they're on. Now, Ceaușescu's in panic mode. So, him and Elena do what all great leaders do when the country's on fire. They bail. They get in a helicopter and they try to flee the capital. But it's like watching a bad sitcom. First, they forget the briefcase with the money and the emergency plans. Then, their pilot fakes engine trouble to ditch them. So, they carjack a dude with a tiny car and hide in the village doctor's house. They went from ruling 23 million people to hiding in a dusty pantry with a sack of stolen cash and no plans. Eventually, they're captured by the army and brought to a military base. Now, you'd think this would be a great start of some long legal process, but no. Romania's new government was like, you know what? Just go full Judge Judy on this. And on December 25th, 1989, the Ceaușescus are put on trial. Here's how fast it goes. They're charged with genocide, undermining the economy, abuse of power, etc., etc., etc. The time to prepare a defense was about 5 minutes, and the time from trial start to execution was less than 2 hours. It was rough, it was fast, and it was televised. They're taken outside to a wall, and a firing squad lines up. Elena screams, "Don't kill us," and Nicolae starts singing the national anthem. And then, boom, a hail of bullets, over 100 rounds. Both of the Ceaușescus die instantly. You know it's a bad day when your Christmas morning ends with your firing squad speedrunning your exit from history. And yes, they did film it. The footage aired on Romanian TV 2 days later, and Merry Christmas, Romania. So, what happened next? Well, the People's Palace still stands. It's now home to Parliament, a museum, and some extremely haunted energy. Romania slowly rebuilt, very slowly. And the Ceaușescus? Well, they're buried in a Bucharest cemetery with very little fanfare. Their graves are often vandalized. The legacy? One of Europe's most brutal, bizarre, and wildly mismanaged dictatorships. They weren't just cruel, they were comically incompetent. They tried to build a perfect communist state and ended up with a flaming garbage pile wrapped in velvet curtains. So let's recap. Banned abortion, forced pregnancies, a destroyed generation of kids, micromanaging food intake while hoarding chocolate, built a palace instead of an economy, gets booed and panics like a drunk raccoon, fled like amateurs and got caught in a bush, tried in 90 minutes, and shot on Christmas. Now, a few things I didn't mention just for the sake of this bit. He also had a national haircut policy. Men were expected to get the same haircut. He gave himself a king's scepter that was comically very just distasteful. Salvador Dali sent him a letter congratulating him on his new royal bling, and they loved the letter so much that they actually posted it in the newspaper, not realizing he was trolling them. Ceaușescu wanted to go down in history as a god, and he ended up as a cautionary tale for what happens when your ego gets bigger than your country. Now, if you like this absolutely unhinged dive into one of history's dumbest dictatorship, do me a solid. Leave me a review, hit that follow button, and tell your friends that Romania once had a dictator who destroyed a city because he didn't like the view from his balcony. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Dumbfounded podcast, where history proves that being dumb is absolutely timeless. If you laughed, learned something, or just feel slightly smarter by comparison, do me a solid and follow the show. Leave us a review. It really helps history nerds find me. And honestly, I crave the validation. If you have an idea for a show topic, please leave it in the comments. Until next time, guys, stay dumbfounded.